Well, good evening, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure and delight to be introducing our keynote speaker, Daniel C. Moos, Charles. It is a great pleasure because Dan is a professor and department chair of education at Gustavus Adolphus College. He also has this additional daunting task, which is the college assessment director. And when I read that description, it just scared the heck out of me. Because Dan is involved in all kinds of assessment that deal with not only student learning, but also teacher assessment. And it's a huge responsibility for his college and also for the work that he does in terms of teacher training. In terms of his training, Dan got his undergrad degree at Amherst College. He taught several years in middle school and high school in Maryland. And then I was fortunate enough to be on Dan's committee when he was doing his master's at University of Maryland, along with James Burns, who was your advisor at the time. That's when I met Dan. And so Dan did his master's in human development at Maryland, and then I had the fortune and the good fortune of being Dan's PhD and doctoral advisor and part of the family. And so then he also got his PhD in human development at the University of Maryland, where he also taught. It was actually one of my worst courses that I ever taught in my career. It was a course on teaching technology to teachers, and Dan was my TA. And it was, thanks Dan for being there, because without Dan was my coping mechanism. It was very challenging, so thank you, Dan. So while he was a student, of course, he also taught several graduate and undergraduate courses for us, and then Dan joined the Gustavus Adolphus College in 2007 as an assistant professor on tenure track, and as I mentioned, he's now a professor. In terms of teaching, he does everything from educational technology to tech, cognitive development, developmental psychology, and he's also extremely involved in the training and mentoring of pre-service teachers. And that is one of the things that Dan, as I know you for, my gosh, now 20 years, that he's very passionate about is actually teaching. And he's actually one of the few of the researchers in our field in terms of dealing with how do we teach self-regulation in terms of teaching and teachers' professional development. And that is an area that we need more research upon. Okay? And so if there are any junior students, faculty, who want to pursue that, then I would encourage you to talk to Dan. In terms of his primary research interests, Dan obviously is known for his work on hypermedia, his work on extensive work on using think aloud protocols to analyze the cognitive, metacognitive, and motivational processes, and he's also one of the few who infuses and studies motivation in terms of hypermedia, and also another area that we are desperately seeking quality research in. His research cuts across different developmental levels, including middle school, high school, and undergraduate students, and of course pre-service teachers. And his focus is on emerging technologies, and of course, as we all know, academic emotions. His current research, which is very interesting, another area that we need much more research on, is looking and examining cognitive load theory and hypermedia and linking that with self-regulated learning. We've got to stop basically looking at cognitive load as a post hoc self-report measure that happens after somebody attempts to monitor and regulate. So how can we look at the cognitive loads, and that's what Dan is doing. In terms of his research, is obviously published in the top tier journals, which are amazing, so Contemporary Psych, Instructional Science, Computers and Human Behavior, and Computers and Education. And his stellar research is presented both nationally and internationally, both at AERA, as you probably saw this morning for those of you who are at our symposium, but also internationally in terms of the Early Conference and the Learning Sciences Conference. He also serves our field extremely well and does an excellent job, so if you want Dan on your editorial board, sorry Dan, not that you need more work, he does excellent reviews, okay? So, and that is extremely important, especially coming from an editor's perspective, okay? So you're not going to get the one paragraph or one sentence. It's going to be complete, comprehensive, and formative. And so Dan serves as an editorial board member for Contemporary Psych and also for our journal Metacognition Learning. And he contributes immensely because he was the SSRL SIG coordinator. So please, and if you don't know him by now, then Dan is not an excellent scholar, but he's also a wonderful human being. And I'm trying to say that without crying. So thank you, Dan. And without further delaying this, let's help me in joining and welcoming Dan.
Well, thank you for that. I'm going to buy some time because I'm kind of blushing. Thank you for that kind introduction. And for those of you who know Roger, shouldn't be surprised by the graciousness of that introduction. And as I'm plugging this in, I also want to take the opportunity to thank and acknowledge the board and echo Tova's words and thank you for all the work that you've done in making us a special community. And just for record, I do not have any surprises at the end of this effort. Sorry. So when I began thinking about this presentation, I reflected on my career, which, as Roger mentioned, started out as a teacher, elementary and middle school right outside of Washington, D.C. And in doing so, I actually came across a picture of my very first class. This is about half of my sixth graders. And it had been years since I've seen this picture. And it reminded me of two things. One, I had a bit more hair at that time. And for those of you familiar with hockey hair, I'm a native Minnesotan, I played hockey. I unfortunately carried the hockey hair into my first years of teaching. But of more relevance to this presentation, my first-hand experience was self-regulation. And I didn't see the self-regulation at that time, but my first-hand experience of active participation in learning. It made a real difference in my sixth grade classroom. And because of that, I made a commitment that very first year to support my students' development in this area. And so I met with our sixth grade team, and I met with the middle school teachers, and we at the time identified what we thought were natural mechanisms to support active participation, note-taking, and highlighting. In part because our 7th and 8th grade teachers told us they need to do this in order to have a successful experience. So we envisioned producing sixth graders at Marching Middle School that used strategic highlighting and created notes that not only thoughtfully engaged the content, but also thoughtfully engaged their thinking. I failed, and I failed pretty miserably. Does anyone want to hazard a guess what my sixth graders' highlighting looked like? It was a mess. It was haphazard use of colored highlighters with very few letters escaping the wrap of the highlighter, a few does here and there. But in essence, looked like this. So here I was committed to supporting active participation, and that really, in retrospect, I undermined their learning. They were actively participating, but this actually undermined their learning. So at the end of that first year, I walked away with an impression that very much shapes where I am today. Self-regulated learning is incredibly important in the classroom, and it was frustratingly difficult to support. And I was really, quite frankly, frustrated at the end of the year because here I was committed to supporting their development in this area, but I wasn't meeting that goal. I felt like something was missing, and that's what I'd like to explore with you, and I really appreciate this opportunity for this. It's truly a privilege to have this time to talk to you about this. And the way I'd like to frame this conversation is around this notion that there is a missing ingredient to self-regulated learning classrooms, as we'll talk about here in a minute. And I'd like to propose that it might be the teacher, and specifically the teacher as a learner, as a way to explore or explain this apparent paradox, which I'll unpack here shortly. I'd like to first really pretty quickly unpack some of the relevant literature. I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I do want to frame this conversation around some relevant literature. And in my opinion, one way to do that is to categorize the research around units of study, or at least primary units of study. So certainly we have research that is focused on the individual student and the impact of self-regulation on his or her learning outcomes. These all look familiar. These are certainly what drives our research. And as we know, those theoretical frameworks really advocate methodologies that produce process data. So our group uses, as Roger mentions, think alouds, and we've graduated from the recording and the transcriptions, which take ages, to trying to leverage existing technologies to capture think alouds to make the process a bit more efficient. But we don't create the technologies. We try to leverage existing technologies for the concurrent think alouds. And certainly there are others that develop technology platforms. So think of Winnie's and colleagues and in G-Study, and of course Roger's cutting edge technology with MetaTutor and MetaMentor. But I think it's safe to say at this point, we know that self-regulation matters for the student and performance. And I think it can be further extended by the very nature of today's classroom. nonlinear access to multiple representations. We can also turn to research that the primary unit of study is the classroom itself, or classroom features, or potentially or the pedagogical choices teachers make. And if we look to recent reviews and meta-analyses, I think it paints, in my opinion, a pretty convincing story that SRL is in fact teachable, and explicit instruction, that's the key part. Explicit instruction makes a difference in the classroom, both in terms of performance and motivation. And I have to share, I won't share a lot of middle school stories, but I do have to share one middle school story. So whenever I read a review, an article that advocates a certain instructional approach or strategy, I think of my first mentor, teaching mentor, affectionately called Mr. C by students and colleagues. And by all accounts was a master middle school teacher, and if you've had the opportunity of teaching 11, 12, 13-year-olds, or maybe you have an 11, 12, 13-year-old, or maybe you know an 11, 12, 13-year-old, these are wonderfully challenging, difficult years, and teachers that can meet the needs of middle schools are truly master teachers, and Mr. C was, by all accounts, a master teacher. So I would often bring him an article that was advocating a certain strategy that I could back and work for my sixth graders or possibly his middle schoolers. And his reaction was often a knee-jerk reaction. Makes sense on paper, doesn't make sense in my classroom. And inevitably, I knew he was going to respond that way. I still brought him the paper. And in fact, there's some research that suggests this perspective is actually shared by many teachers. That teachers hold this perspective that, in fact, they have this inside knowledge and that the understanding of the complexities and dynamics of a classroom are difficult, if not impossible, to capture in research that's done outside the classroom. However, I would make the argument that this field has produced strategies, approaches, and initiatives that make a whole lot of sense in the classroom. We look to Heifer and Marie White's work with homework logs. I certainly wish I had these when I was teaching sixth grade. But these make a lot of sense, and they're scalable. They can be used for a wide range of developmental groups and in different content areas. We had the pleasure of listening to Dr. Karen Harris a couple of years ago at this SIG and her work with SRSD, which has been wildly popular and successful. And if you break down the components of what this entails, I would argue this reflects in many ways best practices. And it just so happens to package a way to support self-regulations. And of course, Nancy Perry and colleagues' work in looking at contextual features. Again, if you break this down, this is, if I were to go in and observe a teacher, this is what I would hope to see in terms of best practices. Complex reading and writing activities, challenging tasks, and the use of non-threatening evaluation processes. In fact, we even have initiatives started by teachers because they were fed up with passive learners. And the PEAL initiative out of Australia. So we have, across these strategies, instructional approaches, and in programs, we have this assumption that students benefit from explicit instruction of how to learn. And that's been around for decades. So we seem to have all the pieces in place for self-regulated classrooms. We have evidence that it matters for students. We have research that provides accessible strategies and approaches, but the research paints a very different picture. Research has looked at whether or not we see evidence. We have some evidence that, in fact, there's limited access or support for strategies and tactics in the classroom. We have other research that has pointed to limited growth of SRL across developmental groups, and we have other evidence that is focused on explicit teaching and hasn't found much of it going on in the classroom. So to us, it paints a really interesting and frustrating paradox, because on one hand, we seem to have everything in place to have these self-regulated classrooms, yet on the other hand, there isn't evidence that's happening in the classroom. So something is going on. There seems to be a missing ingredient, and that's where we come to what I think is the teacher is a learner, is a potential way to begin to explain this. And so I'd like just to share a few other pieces of what I think are relevant research, including some from us, and then end with some implications and questions we're thinking about that we certainly don't have answers to, but I think are worthwhile considering. I think the first step is to consider what is it that teachers actually know about SRL. And I would urge you, if you're interested in this area, if you haven't had a chance to read Lawson et al.'s recent recent article. I think it's a must-read for this area, but among other things, this article paints a picture of what teachers know about SRL within the context of assumption that many hold, myself included, that academic achievement reflects a sophisticated understanding of how to learn. So you think about particularly pre-service teachers or beginning teachers who generally meet pretty high academic benchmarks. The teachers in our teacher education program are admitted to a selective college, and then afterwards they're admitted to a very selective teacher education program. So by most accounts, they've met these very high academic standards, and I've been guilty of assuming they know how to learn. In fact, research would suggest that undergraduates, even high-performing undergraduates, can have a surprisingly unsophisticated understanding how to learn. And shortly I'll share, that's what we're seeing from our pre-service teachers as well. Another dimension that we think is really important to consider when looking at self-regulated classrooms or belief systems. So what do teachers believe about SRL? And again, I think the research paints quite a surprising picture in that many teachers believe SRL should not be explicitly taught for a whole host of reasons. And these are just a few, one of which is that teachers can believe SRL develops naturally or through maturation. Others, by extension, may believe that it shouldn't be taught or cannot be taught. And still others believe that it really is only for a small demographic of students. And if I have a classroom of 30, it doesn't make sense to cater to the needs of 20. So there's this belief system that it may be working against any support or instruction we give to them. And the third dimension that we think is important to consider for self-regulated classrooms, how do teachers actually self-regulate their own learning? Now, you can't teach what you don't know. And so I think that's a fundamental perspective. How do they actually self-regulate their own learning? And that's something we've been really interested in the last couple of years. And we've done a number of studies, most of which have looked at how teachers self-regulate their learning in a platform designed for a flipped classroom, so it's interactive, and looked at the impact of various prompts and scaffolds. And generally, the findings have been fairly consistent. Generally speaking, our pre-service teachers engage in pretty superficial self-regulatory processes in the absence of prompts. And that the real qualitative difference in what we would constitute as effective self-regulation doesn't emerge until they are prompted across multiple phases of SRL. And those are findings that surprised us a bit, that in the absence of prompts, here are really beginning teachers engaging in pretty superficial self-regulated learning. But as I mentioned, this aligns with what others have found with undergraduates. And they can have a surprisingly unsophisticated understanding of how to learn. And we were not hypothesizing this. We were a bit shocked, and this happened repeatedly. But when we took a step back and considered the context, and this is a bit egocentric comment, I'm referring to K-12 systems in the U.S. If there's not a whole lot of evidence that there's explicit SRL instruction in K-12 systems, and our pre-service teachers are being successful in that context, it should maybe not be that surprising that they have a sophisticated understanding, at least in terms of self-regulated learning. So in terms of implications, particularly in terms of what we think we can do to help increase self-regulated learning classrooms, first, advocate what others have already argued, but I'm believing this more and more each year that teacher education programs are the intervention point. I think at 2-3 years into teaching, I think that's too late, particularly if you look at retention. So I think teacher education programs are the intervention point. And this is not just teaching teachers how to support SRL, but it's actually teaching teachers how to self-regulate their own learning. And we do have some really interesting lines of research which gives us directions of how to do that. So for example, we've had some look at self-peer assessment projects. Tova's work with computer-mediated SRL support and reflection exercises that focus on both successes and challenges seem to work really well with developing self-regulated learning with teachers, as well as the types of prompts, so specific versus general prompts seem to work much better with pre-service teachers. This is not without challenges, though, from our perspective, that that need to be considered. One, I've already mentioned the belief systems. So if teachers don't believe that SRL should be taught, it's not going to do much good to teach them how to teach SRL. So I think that needs to be addressed concurrently with teaching them how to support SRL. And that's no easy task, as we know from the conceptual change literature. Belief systems tend to be robust, resistant to change, but we also have some promising interventions and directions to think about. Mild cognitive conflict, the conceptual change framework or model we've been using with some success in our teacher education program. So that seems to be promising. The other, and this is something Roger mentioned, the cognitive overload experience by all teachers, but particularly beginning teachers. And it's really pretty staggering if you take a step back and think how much information a teacher has to process and act upon in a really short period of time in order to have an effective classroom. So here's a list, no particular order. Apply lesson plans that meet the diverse needs of students, identify external and internal distractions, manage external and internal distractions, identify student verbal and nonverbal cues, address student verbal and nonverbal cues, monitor students' level of attention, assess prior knowledge, the list goes on. Okay, all of that with 20 to 30 different students. Okay, you can imagine that a beginning teacher feels quite overwhelmed. Oh, this is I felt obligated to include this. This is me feeling overwhelmed talking about learning styles with my teachers. Okay, this is a stock picture of an overwhelmed teacher. So it's not surprising that teachers experience cognitive overload. And in fact, we've done some research to try to explain why these beginning teachers who, by all accounts, were well positioned to support self-regulated learning in the classroom, they had the capacity and they had a belief system, didn't. And we experienced this informally through the supervision, and we decided to address it more systematically through research, and we found that they resorted to this fast and frugal approach. And so these were teachers we identified as being in a position to use more progressive approaches in the classroom, including supporting self-regulated learning, but upon observation, they were resorting to more traditional methods, so direct instruction with the elementary or lecture with the middle. And it's part simply because they were overwhelmed. They were trying to process all of this information at any given time, and they felt overwhelmed, so they resorted to a more traditional, and they went away from these practices that require more processing but support self-regulated learning. And of course, if you walk into a classroom of a more experienced or master teacher, they're not going to experience that same sense of feeling overwhelmed because they've automated some of those activities. So a few things we're trying to do, because we are very committed to supporting our beginning teachers to support SRL, is limiting some of the activities. Even something as simple as creating a consistent lesson plan structure from the very beginning of the teacher education program to the end. Seems to offload some of that processing. Certainly the narrative changes to that consistent structure seems to help. Ideally, at the end of a teacher education program, teachers come into the field with a wide variety of strategies. We found that can actually be a double-edged sword because they need to, at any given time, process all these different strategies, figure out which one to apply, and that actually can create some cognitive overload that impedes their capacity. So we're trying to actually limit the number of pedagogies they use and really focus on what we believe are the most effective. And I also think, looking to Roger's work, I think there's real potential for technology to strategically offload some of this information that teachers are trying to process at any given time to support self-regulation. All right, so I know we've got about 5 minutes left, and I want to end with questions that, again, I said I don't have answers to, but I think are really important for us to consider, because I really do think that this is a concerning paradox that we're not seeing more evidence of self-regulation in the classroom. The first is kind of a fundamental question: is there a well-defined pedagogy for teaching SRL? So if we were to sit down with a teacher and explain how do you teach SRL, could we articulate that in such a way that they could understand it, both in terms of declarative, conditional, procedural understanding of the strategy? And I think there are some complicating factors, at least from my perspective, one of which is the issue of domain specificity, which has been around for a while, and if in fact there are some processes that are domain specific that would impact the pedagogy, and that complicates things. And also, I did not have a chance to touch on Allison's great work with co-regulation and shared regulation, but certainly in any classroom that involves discussion, that shared knowledge construction is a big part of it. And I think it makes sense that these two require unique processes when compared to self-regulation. So if I'm going to teach my students how to effectively co-regulate, that's going to be a different pedagogy than teaching my students how to self-regulate. So how do we articulate that to teachers? I'm also, as Roger mentioned, I am the college assessment director. I'm looking forward to that ending. But one thing I have learned is to be patient, and in addition to that is the importance of proactively identifying an assessment mechanism. So if you value something and you want to institute something, it is much more difficult to reactively create some way to assess it. So I think that's important for us to consider. If we value self-regulated learning classrooms, we also have to proactively identify how we're going to evaluate self-regulated learning classrooms. And I also would advocate this needs to extend beyond a binary evaluation. It has to be more than it's either supported or it's not. And I think it should really extend to something that captures a continuum of expertise for supporting self-regulated learning. And I think one potential promising direction is to look towards the Edtpa. And if you're not familiar with that, it's a capstone project that student teachers, beginning teachers, are required to complete during their student teaching placement. And it's a pretty extensive project that includes quite a bit of narrative, reflection, videotape of their lessons, student work that's externally scored by Pearson through 15 rubrics. And for most institutions, not all, but most, a score of 2 actually passes. And the idea is that a 2 reflects the expectations of the beginning teacher. A 3 might be an advanced beginning teacher, 4 is an experienced teacher, 5 is a master teacher. So this is capturing a continuum of expertise, and it's formative in some way. But we're curious how this might translate into evaluating self-regulation in the classroom. Where would we expect a beginning teacher to be in terms of supporting self-regulation in the classroom? And another really interesting concept that I have not come across a lot of research, so if you have, I'd love to hear about it. This idea of self-regulated teaching, which is different than self-regulated learning. But I think if we're going to really fully understand a self-regulated learning classroom, we also have to consider how the teacher is self-regulating his or her own teaching, not just the students, but how the teacher is self-regulating his or her own teaching, and that's conceptually different. And I'm not aware of a robust body of research which is looked at. We certainly have pockets, but I think it would be interesting. And last, but certainly not least, is the challenge that we're facing, and I suspect others are as well. It's this tension between how we're preparing our teachers and the reality of the workplace. There's plenty of research that has looked at the nature of curricular discussions in the classroom, and they tend to focus on content acquisition, and self-regulation, of course, is about the process of learning. So how do you prepare teachers to be advocates of the process of learning when the environment is focusing on the content acquisition? So there are a lot of questions we are thinking about, but I do think we're in a pivotal time if we want to see more evidence of self-regulated learning in the classroom. But thank you all for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Dan. That's really a very timely and important topic, and as Roger said earlier, it's one that we clearly need a lot more research on. We have some time for discussion and questions. Jim?
Thank you. So, I think when it comes to teaching, it's a very difficult profession. And when it comes to helping students become regular learners, that's a difficult thing too. So it takes a long time of working with students to really get them to regulate. Not to learn a strategy, but to truly regulate. So the implication is that when you're trying to help teachers teach regulation or to become regulated learners, it might take a lot of time. It might take a lot of effort. It just doesn't happen with a workshop, and it doesn't happen with reading. It happens through other mechanisms. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about if you agree with that and what the implications are for how we need to help teachers become more regulated and to teach regulation. That, in terms of that,
Well, I'll share mine. I'm sure other people have their thoughts. So I don't have answers. I have thoughts. So I'd love to hear other people's perspective. I think from my experience in working with teachers, it's a mindset because it is an investment. The return on the investment is small in the beginning and it's much larger at the end. As Tim said, it does take a lot of time. So let me give you a quick example of where I failed with my 6th graders. I try to teach them how to take notes and learn the content at the same time. And so I was asking them to learn a skill while learning the content, and it undermined both. And if I were to do it again, I would have focused on helping them learn the skill in a contextualized way, understanding that their acquisition of the content may be slowed down. But that requires a certain mindset and a willingness to move through the content much slower. And I think, from my perspective, again, it's egocentric. The U.S. school systems, it's so standards-based, that particularly beginning teachers, when they're not tenured, feel a pressure to move through the content quickly, and they don't necessarily see the connection between the process of learning and content acquisition. So I think that we're trying to work with our teachers, both in terms of being advocates for this, and also changing their mindsets about why they're doing this. And I would love if anyone else has perspective. Did that answer?
So for example, just kind of reflecting on what Tim just asked, right? So then what do you see as the role of technology in terms, can we accelerate the training? Can we make the training more effective by using technology or training teachers, specific teachers? So what do you see the role of technology? What can it do?
Lane, you could probably better answer what it could do from the kind of technology side, but I think from the teachers, yeah. I think particularly for a beginning teacher, any information technology can provide that can offload what they would have to be processing. So I think the number, and someone fill in the blank, what do you think is the number one concern of beginning teachers? Classroom management. And the biggest challenge for classroom management, what we try to advocate is kind of proactive strategies. And if students are engaged, are much less likely to disrupt class. And so if there's some kind of feedback that technology can provide about engagement, that's going to proactively address classroom management. So you've done a lot of work with measuring affective states and emotions. If as a teacher I'm getting information that Bobby seems frustrated in the corner, right? That's going to help facilitate and proactively address classroom management issues. Is that?
Other questions? Yes.
It went by quickly, or I was out in left field. Did you propose that we add something to the TAP about self-regulated learning? Like in the spirit of you get what you assess, right? If we assess it in new teachers, then they're much more likely to do it than if we don't assess it.
I would love to add that to that TP, but that's way beyond my powers. But what I was saying, I meant to say that that model of how it assesses teachers might be a way that we could use to assess self-regulated learning in the classroom, in the sense that the rubric is intended to reflect a continuum of expertise. So beginning teachers are expected to get a 2. And in my opinion, we need to come up with some framework to assess self-regulated in the classroom that accounts for where we think beginning teachers should be.
I don't think that is beyond your power. I think you can get on the board or something and just add it.
Well, but I will say this though. I will say the Edtpa is externally scored through Pearson, and there are some. We don't take their scores we're not convinced those scores are reliable. And so it would, if that's added, then it would require those who are trained in SRL.
Right, that's good.
Yes?
Other comments? Yes.
I'm just wondering what you think is the role of the sociocultural context in terms of supporting the development of SRL and teacher candidates or pre-service teachers. And I guess having that sort of contextually based experience, I guess drawing on Allison's work and others about sort of the socially constructed knowledge and how that could help support SRL learning practices.
Yeah, I guess I'd point again to the pedagogy. So teaching in an environment that does support the co-regulation is very different than teaching in an environment where it's mostly direct instruction, and it involves some self-regulation. But I think that would greatly impact the pedagogy and the training of teachers of how to support the co-regulation. And Allison can probably speak to this better than I, but there are unique dimensions to co-regulation compared to self-regulation, which impacts the pedagogy for teaching that.
So do we as teacher educators then have to change our pedagogy and practice as well to?
Well, so from my perspective, I think it's more fundamental than that. I think we have to first identify whether our pre-service teachers can engage in co-regulation or self-regulation, and I think we need a clear conceptualization of what this means, and we have to do a better job of helping develop those processes within our teacher education, our teacher candidates.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you.
We appreciate it.
And thank you also, Dr. Del Schunk.